In the summer of 2003, a pair of bald eagles claimed a stretch of shoreline along a glacial lake in northern Wisconsin that a family of ospreys had occupied for 6 consecutive breeding seasons. The ospreys had built a substantial nest on a dead white pine snag at the water's edge, raised young there, and returned to the same site across multiple migrations with the kind of fidelity that ornithologists have documented in ospreys across their range. The nest was large, structurally sound, and positioned over water with direct sightlines that made it defensible and productive. The eagles wanted it. What followed was not a single displacement event. It was not a brief territorial contest that resolved cleanly in favor of the larger predator and ended with the ospreys simply finding somewhere else to nest. What followed was 11 years of contested tenure over the same site, the same surrounding water corridor, and in some seasons, the same individual nest structure between the same eagle pair and the successive generations of ospreys attempting to use the territory. When researchers from the University of Wisconsin and the Raptor Research Foundation reviewed the accumulated observational record in 2014, they had documented something that went substantially beyond what they had expected to find when they began tracking the conflict. They had documented evidence that both species were exhibiting what they described cautiously but explicitly as territorial memory, a capacity to retain, update, and act on spatially specific information about contested sites across time spans that exceeded anything the existing models of avian territorial behavior had predicted or accounted for. If this is the kind of story you find yourself unable to look away from, the kind where the science keeps going deeper the more carefully you look at it, you should subscribe now, because this is what every video here is built around. Stories where the animal behavior is strange enough to be worth your attention and the research behind it is rigorous enough to hold up under scrutiny. Subscribe, then stay with this one, because it goes considerably further than the headline. The baseline facts about bald eagle territorial behavior need to be established clearly because they are both genuinely remarkable and genuinely misunderstood in popular accounts that tend to flatten the complexity. Bald eagles are among the most aggressively territorial large raptors in North America. They hold territories that in productive lakeside and riverine habitats can be as small as a few hundred acres, and in less productive interior habitats can span several square miles. They defend these territories against conspecifics, meaning other bald eagles, with escalating intensity that moves from aerial displays to contact aggression, with a consistency that researchers have documented across populations from Alaska to Florida. What is less commonly understood is that bald eagle territorial behavior is not exclusively directed at members of their own species. Bald eagles are kleptoparasites of remarkable efficiency, meaning they regularly steal prey from other predators, rather than hunting exclusively for themselves, and the behavioral repertoire associated with that strategy overlaps extensively with the territorial aggression they direct at conspecifics. Ospreys are among the most targeted species for kleptoparasitism by bald eagles across their shared range, and the targeting is not random. It reflects something that looks, behaviorally, very much like learned preference for specific individuals, specific sites, and specific behavioral contexts that make successful theft most likely. The osprey is the relevant comparison species in this story, not just because it happens to have been present in the Wisconsin case, but because the bald eagle and the osprey have one of the most extensively documented interspecific relationships in North American raptor biology. They share habitat across virtually the entire continental range of both species. They eat the same prey, principally fish, with an overlap that creates direct resource competition at productive fishing sites. They use similar nest structures, favor similar nest locations, specifically elevated positions with clear water access, and build nests of similar size and material composition that are often structurally interchangeable from the perspective of an eagle looking for a platform to occupy. The osprey builds the nest. The eagle, which is larger, more powerful, and capable of sustained aerial pursuit that the osprey cannot match, takes it. This is a documented pattern across the range of both species, and has been observed often enough that it appears in introductory ornithology texts as a standard example of interspecific competition. What the introductory texts do not capture is the temporal dimension of that competition, the fact that the contest between specific individual eagles and specific individual ospreys does not resolve at a single point in time and remain resolved. It continues. It shifts. It is remembered by both parties in ways that have only recently begun to receive the systematic scientific attention they deserve. The Wisconsin case began receiving that attention partly by accident. The researchers who eventually published the 2014 analysis were not originally studying territorial memory. They were studying bald eagle productivity and habitat use along a network of glacial lakes in Vilas and Oneida counties, a region that hosts one of the highest densities of nesting bald eagles in the contiguous United States. The osprey-eagle conflict at the focal site came to their attention through a network of volunteer nest monitors who had been documenting activity at known eagle and osprey nest sites since the late 1980s. The volunteer data was inconsistent in its detail and variable in its collection methodology, as citizen science data inevitably is, but it covered a time span that professional research monitoring rarely achieves. And when the researchers began systematically reviewing it in the context of their productivity study, they recognized that the pattern at this particular site was unusual enough to warrant a dedicated retrospective analysis. What the volunteer data showed, when reviewed in sequence, was not a story of eagles displacing ospreys and occupying a territory. It was a story of repeated, seasonally structured conflict at a specific site between individually identifiable birds over more than a decade. The eagle pair that initiated the conflict in 2003 was individually identifiable by size difference, the female being substantially larger than the male, as is typical in raptors with reversed sexual size dimorphism, and by field-observable plumage characteristics that experienced monitors had noted in their records. The ospreys at the site were not initially individually marked, which created methodological limitations that the researchers acknowledged explicitly in their analysis. But the osprey's natal fidelity to the site, their consistent return to the same nest structure in successive seasons, and the behavioral continuity documented across the conflict record made a strong circumstantial case that the ospreys involved in the later years of the conflict were at minimum the offspring of the original pair, raised at or near the contested site, and possibly the original pair themselves in the seasons when they successfully bred there. That last possibility is the one that starts to pull on something important. Ospreys in the northern tier of their North American range live on average between 15 and 20 years in the wild. Bald eagles in comparable habitat live longer, with documented lifespans of 25 to 30 years in wild populations. The 11-year span of the documented conflict in Wisconsin falls well within the potential lifespan of both the eagles and the ospreys involved at the outset. The question of whether the same individual birds were participating in the conflict across its full duration is not a question that the available data resolves definitively, but it is a question that shapes the interpretation of everything else in the record, because the difference between territorial behavior maintained by individual memory and territorial behavior maintained by site characteristics that produce similar conflicts between successive occupant pairs is a difference that goes to the heart of what the researchers were eventually prepared to claim about what they had observed. The claim they made was careful but substantial. They argued that the behavioral evidence across the 11-year record was most parsimoniously explained by a model in which individual birds on both sides of the conflict retained specific information about the site, about the behavioral patterns of their opponents, and about the outcomes of specific prior interactions, and that this retained information was influencing behavioral decisions in ways that produced outcomes deviating from the predictions of models that assumed territorial behavior was driven entirely by current season resource assessment, without reference to prior conflict history. This is not a trivial claim. It sits at the intersection of several active debates in behavioral ecology about the cognitive capacities of birds, the mechanisms underlying territory establishment and maintenance, and the degree to which individual learning history shapes population-level patterns in ways that ecologists need to account for in their models. To understand why the claim is substantial and why it matters beyond this specific case, it is necessary to spend some time with what behavioral ecologists actually mean when they talk about territorial memory, what the prior evidence base for the capacity looked like in 2014 when the Wisconsin paper was published, and what has changed in the research landscape since. Territorial memory, as a distinct cognitive phenomenon, refers to the retention of spatially specific information about previously contested sites, and the use of that information to make behavioral decisions about territorial establishment, defense, and challenge in subsequent time periods. It is distinct from simple site fidelity, which is the tendency of animals to return to previously used sites regardless of prior contest history. It is distinct from general spatial memory, which is the well-documented capacity of many bird species to remember food cache locations, foraging routes, and habitat patch quality. Territorial memory specifically implies that information about prior contests, specifically information about site value, opponent identity, opponent behavioral profile, and prior conflict outcomes, is stored and subsequently retrieved in ways that influence behavior in contexts where it is operationally relevant. The prior evidence base for territorial memory in birds in 2014 was suggestive but thin. The clearest work had been done in passerine species, specifically song sparrows and great tits, where controlled experimental studies had demonstrated that individuals responded differently to playback from known versus unknown rivals, and that they incorporated information about prior contest outcomes into their subsequent challenge and defense behavior in ways consistent with individual recognition and memory of prior interactions. The work on larger raptors was less developed, partly because the methodological challenges of studying large-bodied, long-lived, wide-ranging birds are substantially greater than those of studying small passerines in enclosed study plots, and partly because the prior contest record for specific raptor pairs is rarely available at the resolution and time span needed to test the memory hypothesis rigorously. The Wisconsin case was unusual in providing both a long-duration conflict record and a relatively closed spatial context, the specific lake and shoreline corridor, that allowed behavioral observations to be tied to specific individuals with a degree of confidence not available in studies of more wide-ranging birds. The conflict record itself, reviewed in the full detail available from the monitoring data, reveals a pattern of escalating and de-escalating intensity that tracks across seasons with a structure that simple resource competition models do not predict well. In the first 2 seasons of documented conflict, 2003 and 2004, the eagle's behavior at the Osprey nest site was primarily kleptoparasitic. They intercepted ospreys returning to the nest with fish, pursued them in sustained aerial chases, and occasionally occupied the nest structure briefly before abandoning it. They did not attempt to take over the site as a nesting territory in those seasons. The ospreys defended the site aggressively, with the male osprey repeatedly engaging the larger female eagle in aerial confrontations that were costly in terms of energy expenditure and, on at least 2 documented occasions, resulted in what monitors described as contact between birds in extended aerial struggles. By 2005 and 2006, the character of the eagle pair's behavior at the site had shifted. They were spending more time perched at the nest structure itself, including extended periods of presence there during times when the ospreys were absent or foraging elsewhere. The ospreys, in documented response, altered their approach patterns to the nest, using longer indirect routes that reduced the frequency of interceptions at the nest rim. The female eagle was observed on multiple occasions carrying nest material to the site, a behavior that, in bald eagle behavioral ecology, is a strong indicator of nest adoption intent rather than simple territorial visitation. The ospreys successfully bred at the site in both 2005 and 2006, but with reduced productivity compared to the pre-conflict seasons documented in the volunteer records. The nest defense effort, documented by monitors, was substantially higher than in prior seasons, which the researchers interpreted as an increase in the behavioral cost of site tenure that was beginning to affect breeding investment. 2007 was the first season in the documented record in which the eagles successfully prevented the ospreys from breeding at the primary nest site. The osprey pair was present at the site early in the season, documented arriving within a week of their historical mean arrival date, but was displaced before egg-laying by a sustained period of eagle presence at the nest that monitors described as the most intense territorial behavior they had documented at any eagle-osprey interface in their observation network. What is particularly notable about the 2007 season in the research record is not simply that the eagles won that year's contest. It is the timing and the behavioral specificity of their response to the osprey arrival. The eagles were documented increasing their time at the nest site and the intensity of their aggressive displays in the days immediately following osprey arrival, which was itself a temporally predictable event given the osprey's consistent historical arrival dates. The researchers noted in their analysis that this pattern was consistent with the eagles having retained information about the seasonal timing of osprey arrival and mounting a preemptive territorial response timed to the expected arrival window rather than simply reacting to osprey presence when it occurred. This is the detail that begins to pull the analysis away from simple resource competition and towards something that looks more like anticipatory behavior grounded in prior experience. An eagle that simply responds to ospreys when they appear is doing something behaviorally and cognitively different from an eagle that escalates its territorial effort in advance of osprey arrival at a time consistent with that arrival's historical pattern. The second behavior implies retained temporal information that is being used to prepare a behavioral response in advance, which is a more complex cognitive operation than real-time threat response. The researchers were appropriately cautious about this interpretation, noting that the observational data did not allow them to rule out alternative explanations, including the possibility that environmental cues associated with osprey arrival were triggering eagle response independently of retained information about the specific site history. But they considered this alternative less parsimonious, given the full context of the behavioral record, and noted it as a direction warranting experimental investigation. The 2008 through 2011 seasons represent what the researchers described as a dynamic equilibrium phase in the conflict record. The ospreys returned to the site each season, sometimes successfully breeding and sometimes not, in a pattern that showed significant year-to-year variation that the researchers were not able to fully account for with available data. The eagle pair's success in excluding the ospreys from the nest varied with what monitors characterized as the eagle's own breeding effort and timing. Years in which the eagles were engaged in active incubation at their own nest approximately 800 meters from the osprey site showed reduced intensity of osprey site monitoring and correspondingly higher osprey breeding success. This inverse relationship between eagle breeding effort and osprey territory success at the contested site was one of the most robust patterns in the dataset, and pointed toward a resource allocation dynamic in the eagle's behavior that had clear implications for understanding when the memory and experience of prior contests was being actively deployed versus when it was effectively suspended by competing demands on the eagle's behavioral budget. That pattern is worth sitting with because it reveals something about the nature of territorial memory that purely cognitive accounts of the phenomenon miss. Territorial memory is not simply a matter of storing information and retrieving it when relevant. It is embedded in a behavioral and physiological context that determines when and how the information is acted upon. The Wisconsin Eagles were not simply remembering the Osprey site and acting on that memory continuously. They were managing competing territorial and reproductive priorities across a landscape that included their own nest, their own mate, and their own seasonal schedule. And the Osprey site conflict was being fitted into that larger behavioral context in ways that produced the year-to-year variation in conflict intensity that the monitoring record documented. This is a more ecologically realistic picture of how territorial memory functions in long-lived, wide-ranging birds than the cleaner experimental results from passerine studies tend to suggest. And it has direct implications for how behavioral ecologists should be modeling these systems. The 2012 season introduced a new element to the conflict record that the researchers described as the most unexpected finding in the dataset. The Osprey pair that arrived at the site in 2012 was behaviorally different from those documented in prior seasons, in ways that were sufficiently pronounced to be noted independently by multiple monitors. The 2012 Ospreys were more aggressive in their initial territorial display behavior, more persistent in their challenges to eagle presence at the nest, and showed a pattern of nest approach and defense that several monitors compared in their written notes to the behavior of birds that had previous experience with the specific challenge they were facing, rather than birds encountering the competitive dynamic for the first time. One experienced monitor, a retired biology teacher who had been observing the site since 2001, wrote in her notes for that season that the Ospreys in 2012 behaved as though they knew exactly what to expect. Her language was informal and impressionistic, but it pointed toward an observation that the researchers took seriously when they reviewed the full dataset. The question of whether the 2012 Ospreys were individuals with prior experience at the site, either the original pair returning after failed breeding attempts in intervening years, or offspring of the original pair that had been present at the site as young birds and retained information about its competitive dynamic, could not be resolved with the available data. Ospreys were not individually banded or otherwise marked at the site in the early years of the monitoring record. The molecular tools that would allow identification of family relationships from feathers or other biological material recovered from the nest site were not deployed until 2013, when the researchers became aware of the dataset and began their retrospective analysis. The 2012 behavioral observations thus remain in the record as a significant and suggestive. What they suggest, taken at face value, is that the Osprey's side of the conflict was not behaviorally static across the 11-year record any more than the Eagles' side was, and that the information being acted on in the later seasons of the conflict may have included accumulated experience on both sides that was shaping the specific behavioral strategies each species deployed against the other. If that interpretation is correct, and the researchers were careful to present it as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion, it has implications that go substantially beyond the Wisconsin case. It implies that prolonged, interspecific territorial conflicts between individually identifiable long-lived birds can produce something that functions operationally like a bilateral learning process, in which both parties accumulate experience with a specific opponent in a specific spatial context and adjust their behavioral strategies in response. This is qualitatively different from the classic model of interspecific competition, in which each party is responding to the other's behavior as an environmental constant, rather than as a dynamic opponent whose behavioral repertoire is changing in response to the same conflict history. The difference matters because it changes the expected outcomes of these conflicts over time in ways that competitive exclusion models, which assume fixed competitive hierarchies between species, do not predict. The research literature that the Wisconsin paper was entering when it was published in 2014 had been moving in a direction that made its claims more plausible than they would have been a decade earlier, but it was still a literature with substantial resistance to strong claims about the cognitive sophistication of bird behavior in competitive contexts. The theoretical framework of animal cognition had been significantly reshaped by work on corvids, specifically ravens, rooks, and western scrub jays, demonstrating capacities for planning, perspective-taking, and episodic-like memory that had previously been considered uniquely human, or at best, limited to great apes. The corvid work had made it methodologically and theoretically legitimate to take seriously the possibility that large-brained, long-lived birds were doing cognitively sophisticated things in behavioral contexts where simpler explanations would previously have been favored. Raptors are not corvids, and the comparative neuroscience of cognition across avian taxa was and remains a field with more questions than answers. But the intellectual climate in 2014 was one in which the Wisconsin researchers' claims about territorial memory in bald eagles and ospreys could be presented in a peer-reviewed journal and receive a serious hearing rather than being dismissed on a priori grounds. The reception the paper received was mixed in ways that were scientifically productive. The core finding that the behavioral record at the Wisconsin site showed patterns more consistent with a territorial memory model than with models assuming only current season resource assessment, was broadly accepted as an interesting and suggestive observational result. The interpretive claims about anticipatory behavior and bilateral learning were more contested, with critics correctly noting that the observational dataset, however long in duration, was insufficiently controlled to rule out alternative explanations for the patterns documented. The most substantive methodological criticism was the lack of individual identification of the ospreys across the full duration of the conflict, which meant that the central question of whether the same individual birds were involved in the conflict across its 11-year span could not be definitively answered from the available data. This is a genuine limitation, and the researchers did not contest it. What they argued in response was that the behavioral patterns documented in the record were sufficiently coherent and sufficiently unexpected under null models of territorial behavior to justify the investment in the more rigorous follow-up work that the site and the question deserved. That follow-up work, which has been ongoing since 2014 with individually banded birds, individually marked nest structures, GPS tracking of both eagle and osprey movement, and audio recording equipment that has captured thousands of hours of acoustic behavior at and near the contested site, has produced results that are more technically detailed, but in their broad outlines more supportive of the original claims than the paper's critics might have expected. The GPS data has been particularly informative because it has made visible a dimension of the territorial behavior that ground-based observation could not capture, specifically the spatial structure of the movements each species makes in relation to the contested site and in relation to each other's locations, when both are present in the territory. What the GPS data shows for the eagles is that their movement patterns in the vicinity of the contested osprey territory are specifically structured relative to the osprey pair's location in a way that changes seasonally and that cannot be explained by simple responses to topography or food distribution. When the ospreys are present at or near the contested nest site, the eagle's movements show what the researchers have described as directed approach behavior, movement paths that bring the eagles into positions of visual dominance over the site, with a consistency and directionality that the statistical analysis identifies as non-random relative to the eagle's movements in comparable habitat away from the contested area. When the ospreys are absent from the site, foraging elsewhere on the lake system, the eagle's visits to the nest site are briefer, and their behavior there is more exploratory and less display-oriented. The differential in behavior as a function of the osprey's location implies that the eagles have information about the osprey's whereabouts that is being used in real time to calibrate the investment being made in territorial display at the specific contested location. How eagles obtain and process this information is not fully resolved by the tracking data. The most straightforward explanation is acoustic, as ospreys are highly vocal birds with a distinctive call that carries well over open water, and that a resident eagle familiar with the call could use to locate ospreys at ranges beyond visual detection. The GPS data is consistent with this explanation in that the eagle's directed movements toward the contested site frequently begin when they are in positions where the acoustic detection range of the ospreys would include the contested site. But the acoustic hypothesis does not fully account for the temporal structure of the eagle's behavior in the pre-arrival window each spring, where the eagle's intensity at the site increases before the ospreys have arrived and before any acoustic cue from the ospreys could be available. This is the pattern that keeps pulling the researchers back toward an interpretation that involves retained temporal information about the osprey's historical arrival dates, which is to say, toward a form of territorial memory that is specifically temporal rather than spatially triggered. The osprey side of the follow-up data is equally interesting and in some respects more surprising. The individually banded ospreys at the site have demonstrated a behavioral flexibility in response to eagle challenge that the researchers have found difficult to account for under models that treat osprey territorial behavior as a relatively fixed response repertoire, shaped primarily by immediate context. Specifically, the ospreys have been documented modifying their nest approach routes, their foraging departure timing, and their acoustic display behavior in ways that track the eagle's behavioral patterns across the season, in a manner consistent with ongoing behavioral assessment and adjustment, rather than fixed strategic responses. In one of the more striking findings from the follow-up work, the researchers documented that the resident osprey male, individually identifiable by his band combination, altered his fishing route selection during the breeding season in a way that systematically reduced his overlap with the eagle pair's primary foraging corridor. This change in foraging behavior was not present in the same individual's documented behavior in the first season after banding, and appears to have developed across subsequent seasons in a way that suggests behavioral learning driven by prior interception experiences in the specific corridor he subsequently avoided. This is a finding that extends the territorial memory claim from the domain of site defense into the domain of resource exploitation avoidance, which is a different behavioral context with a different set of ecological implications. An osprey that has learned to avoid specific spatial areas associated with high interception risk by a specific eagle pair is doing something that has direct fitness consequences beyond the immediate territorial contest. It is optimizing its foraging behavior relative to a threat that is spatially and temporally predictable because it has retained information about prior experiences with that threat in specific spatial contexts. The fitness implications of this kind of learning are not trivial in an energy-limited breeding context where the efficiency of fish delivery to the nest has direct effects on chick survival and growth rate. The broader research context into which these findings fit has been developing rapidly in the years since the original Wisconsin paper was published, and the developments have in general been moving in a direction that makes the claims about territorial memory in long-lived raptors more rather than less plausible. The most relevant Parallel research has come from work on golden eagles in the Scottish Highlands, where a long-term study of individually marked territorial pairs has documented what the lead researchers describe as intergenerational territorial information transfer. Specifically, the observation that offspring of territorial pairs that have historically occupied specific sites show elevated probability of attempting to occupy those same sites when they reach breeding age, at rates that exceed what would be expected from simple natal philopatry or site quality assessment in the absence of specific prior information about the site. The Scottish work does not demonstrate the mechanism of the information transfer, but it points toward the possibility that in long-lived raptors, information about specific territorial sites, including information about the competitive dynamics associated with those sites, may be transmitted within family units in ways that operate over generational timescales. If that possibility is confirmed by subsequent research, it would substantially change the way behavioral ecologists think about the population-level consequences of territorial behavior in large raptors. Territory quality in standard models is assessed by individuals on the basis of resources present and current competition for access. If information about territorial sites can be transmitted across generations within family units, then territorial decision-making in these species incorporates a historical dimension that current models do not account for, and the outcomes of territorial contests, including interspecific ones, like the Eagle-Osprey conflict in Wisconsin, may be shaped by information histories that extend back further in time than the lifespans of the current participants. This is conceptually important because it means that the outcome of a territorial contest between two individual animals in a specific year is not simply a function of the competitive abilities of those two individuals and the resource value of the site in that year. It is potentially also a function of accumulated information about the site that one or both parties have access to and that shapes their behavioral investment in the contest in ways that are not visible to an observer focused only on the current season. The Wisconsin researchers have been exploring this possibility in the context of their focal site with tools that the original 2014 analysis did not have available. The molecular work on feathers and prey remains collected at the nest site has allowed them to establish family relationships within the osprey population using the site across the post-2013 period, and the results are consistent with a pattern of site occupancy by individuals related to prior site tenants at rates higher than would be expected by chance. This is not proof of intergenerational information transfer, which would require demonstrating the mechanism rather than simply the pattern. But it is consistent with the hypothesis, and in combination with the behavioral data showing that successive osprey occupants of the site deployed territorial strategies that are adaptive to the specific competitive challenge posed by the eagle pair, it makes a circumstantial case that is more compelling than any single line of evidence would be on its own. The eagle pair that initiated the conflict in 2003 was confirmed by banding and resighting data to be still present at the territory, as of the most recent field season included in the follow-up publications, which covers data through 2022. This means that at minimum, one side of the conflict, the eagles, has been represented by the same individuals continuously across a period spanning nearly 2 decades. The female eagle, which is the dominant member of the pair in the territorial interactions documented at the Osprey site, was an adult bird at banding in 2004, indicating that she was at least 5 years old in the year of confirmed banding, and placing her current age at a minimum of 23 years. This is within the documented range for wild bald eagle longevity, but represents an old individual whose behavioral history with the contested site extends across the full period of documented conflict. Whatever she knows about that site, about the ospreys that have contested it, about the seasonal timing of their arrival, and the behavioral patterns of successive opponents, she has had more than 15 years to learn it, refine it, and act on it. The ospreys that occupied the site in the most recent documented seasons were individually banded as nestlings at or near the contested site, and represent, with high confidence based on molecular data, the grandchildren of the ospreys that originally occupied the territory before the conflict began. They are birds that have never known the site without the competitive pressure of the eagle pair. They have never raised young there without having the eagles as a fact of their territorial existence. The behavioral strategies they deploy in managing that competition have been shaped, the research suggests, not only by their own direct experience with the eagles, but by whatever information they received during their development at the site about the competitive dynamic their parents and, before them, their grandparents navigated. The specific mechanism by which that information was transmitted, whether through direct observation of adult behavior, through learned associative responses to specific stimuli associated with the eagles, or through some other pathway that the current research has not yet characterized, is the central open question for the next phase of the work. It is worth pausing on that open question because it connects the specific findings from this case to some of the most actively contested terrain in contemporary behavioral ecology. The mechanisms of information transmission between generations in animals have been studied extensively in the context of song learning in birds, which is one of the best documented forms of cultural transmission in non-human animals. Song learning in Osprey passerines is a clear case where acoustic information is transmitted from adults to juveniles through a developmental process that is behaviorally, neurologically, and genetically well characterized. The extension of cultural transmission concepts to domains other than song, specifically to information about habitat, territorial sites, predators, competitors, and foraging strategies, is conceptually straightforward, but empirically much harder to demonstrate rigorously because the information being transmitted is spatial and behavioral rather than acoustic, and therefore much harder to track with the kind of precision that song dialects allow. The most relevant empirical work for the Wisconsin question has come from studies of anti-predator behavior in birds, where there is now strong evidence from both field and experimental studies that naive birds can acquire information about predators through observation of conspecific responses to those predators, a process called social learning or observational conditioning, and that this information can be transmitted across multiple social and generational links in ways that produce population-level patterns in anti-predator behavior that persist long after the original conditioning event. The functional parallel to territorial information transmission is close, as both involve spatial information about specific threat sources being transferred through social observational mechanisms rather than individual experience. If social learning of anti-predator information can operate across generational links in bird populations, there is no strong a priori reason why analogous processes could not operate for territorial information, including information about interspecific competitive dynamics at specific sites. The researchers working on the Wisconsin system have been exploring this parallel explicitly in the design of their observational protocols for the follow-up work. They have been documenting the behavioral development of osprey chicks at the contested site with particular attention to the chicks' responses to eagle presence during the developmental period when the capacity for observational learning is expected to be highest, specifically during the late nestling and early fledgling stages, when chicks are increasingly alert and responsive to their environment while still at or near the nest site. What they have found is that chick responses to eagle presence at the nest site, measured by the duration and intensity of alarm call production and defensive posture adoption, increase across the developmental period, in a way that tracks adult behavioral responses to the same stimuli, and that this developmental trajectory is steeper and begins earlier in the season, when adult responses to eagles are more frequent and more intense, which is to say, in seasons when the eagles are more active at the site. This pattern is consistent with observational learning from adult behavior, but, as the researchers consistently note, does not rule out alternative developmental explanations, including simple sensitization to eagle stimuli through repeated exposure. The question of mechanism matters for understanding how durable and transmissible the territorial information is. If osprey chicks at the contested site are acquiring information about the eagle pair through observation of their parents' responses to eagle presence, that information would be expected to include not just generic eagle alarm responses, but something more specific about the particular behavioral patterns of the resident eagle pair, because it is those patterns that the adult ospreys are responding to in their daily behavior at the site. A chick that has spent its developmental period watching its parents navigate a specific competitive dynamic with specific opponents in a specific spatial context would be expected to have more specific and operationally useful information about that dynamic than a chick that simply acquired a general eagle alarm response. Whether that specificity is actually present in the behavioral repertoire of site-experienced juvenile ospreys relative to age-matched ospreys without site experience is a question that the researchers have identified as a priority for future experimental work. The spatial memory research in birds that provides the theoretical backbone for thinking about these questions has itself been going through a significant period of development in the decades since the Wisconsin paper was published. Work on Clark's nutcrackers, which cache food items across large spatial extents and retrieve them months later, established the existence of large-scale, durable spatial memory in birds at a resolution that had not previously been appreciated. Subsequent work on a wide range of species has demonstrated that avian spatial memory is a more general and more capable system than it was understood to be in the 1990s, and that the hippocampal structures associated with spatial memory in birds show experience-dependent plasticity, meaning they change in response to spatial learning demands in ways that have functional consequences for memory capacity. Bald eagles and ospreys have not been the subject of detailed comparative neuroanatomical work on hippocampal volume and spatial memory capacity in the way that food-caching corvids and parrots have. But their ecological demands, specifically navigation across large home ranges, return to specific nest sites across multiple annual migrations over the course of long lifespans, and management of territorial boundaries that change and must be monitored over extended periods, make a strong functional argument for substantial spatial memory capacity in both species. The migration component of this picture is one that the research has not fully addressed and that deserves more attention than it has received. Both bald eagles and ospreys are migratory in the northern parts of their range, including the Wisconsin study area. The ospreys at the contested site winter in Central or South America and return to the site each spring after a round-trip journey of several thousand miles. The eagles at the site are partially migratory, shifting their range in response to ice conditions on the lake system, but not undertaking long-distance migrations comparable to those of the ospreys. The fact that the ospreys maintain site fidelity to a specific contested site across multiple annual migrations, returning to the same nest, the same competitors, and the same competitive dynamic after journeys of thousands of miles, implies a degree of spatial memory precision and durability that is remarkable, regardless of the territorial memory question. The additional claim that the returning ospreys also retain specific behavioral information about the competitive dynamic at the site, and that this information influences their territorial strategy in the season following their return, asks for something more than simple site fidelity memory. It asks for a memory system that retains not just location information, but context information associated with a specific place, including information about the competitive history there that is relevant to behavioral decision-making upon return. The closest experimental analog to this claim in the literature comes from work on migratory fish, specifically Pacific salmon returning to natal streams, where there is compelling evidence for olfactory memory of natal stream chemistry that guides return navigation. The salmon case is not directly comparable to the osprey case because it involves chemosensory rather than spatial memory, and because the information retained is about stream identity rather than competitive context. But it establishes the biological principle that animals can retain highly specific sensory information about particular places across the temporal gap of a migration, and use that information upon return in ways that are behaviorally consequential. The extension of this principle to the retention of competitive context information by migratory birds returning to contested territorial sites is conceptually natural, though it remains empirically unconfirmed at the level of rigor that would satisfy the skeptics in the behavioral ecology community. What makes the Wisconsin case scientifically durable beyond the specific claims about territorial memory is the quality of the long-term observational record it has produced and the methodological lessons it has generated for how this kind of research should be designed and conducted going forward. Long-term behavioral studies of individually identifiable wild animals are among the most scientifically valuable data sets in ecology, and they are also among the most difficult and expensive to maintain over the timescales at which the most interesting patterns become visible. The Wilson ornithological record at the Wisconsin site was not designed as a territorial memory study. It was maintained by volunteer citizen scientists who were interested in conservation monitoring rather than behavioral research, and the data quality is variable in ways that limit what can be inferred from the early period of the record. The lesson the researchers drew from this, and which they have communicated explicitly in their published work, is that the development of standardized observational protocols for long-term monitoring at sites where interspecific territorial conflicts are documented represents a significant and underutilized opportunity for behavioral research that would be both scientifically valuable and feasible to execute within the practical constraints of field research programs. The specific methodological recommendations that emerged from the Wisconsin analysis have influenced subsequent raptor research programs in ways that are beginning to generate the kind of multi-site, multi-year comparative data that would allow the territorial memory hypothesis to be tested more rigorously than a single case study permits. Programs in the Pacific Northwest, in the Great Lakes region, and in portions of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, all areas with high densities of both nesting bald eagles and ospreys, and correspondingly high rates of documented interspecific conflict at nest sites, have adopted standardized protocols for documenting eagle-osprey territorial interactions that will eventually produce comparative datasets with the duration and resolution needed for meaningful hypothesis testing. The comparative analysis that those datasets will eventually support will be able to address questions that the Wisconsin case alone cannot answer. Specifically, whether the behavioral patterns documented there are idiosyncratic features of a specific site and a specific pair of competitors, or whether they represent general features of eagle-osprey territorial dynamics that are expressed consistently across the range of both species. The answer to that comparative question will matter considerably for how wildlife managers think about eagle and osprey populations in areas where both species are recovering from historical persecution, chemical contamination, and habitat loss. Both bald eagles and ospreys underwent severe population declines in the mid-20th century, due primarily to organochlorine pesticide contamination, specifically DDT, which caused eggshell thinning and catastrophic reproductive failure across their North American ranges. The recovery of both species following the banning of DDT in 1972 and subsequent conservation efforts has been one of the most successful stories in American wildlife conservation, with both eagle and osprey populations having returned to or exceeded historical levels across most of their former range. The recovery of both species has been geographically simultaneous, which means that the interface between recovering eagle and osprey populations has been intensifying across the landscape over the same period in which the Wisconsin case was playing out. If the territorial memory dynamics documented in Wisconsin are representative of how these species interact during range recovery and recolonization, the implication is that the competitive dynamics between them are more complex, more historically contingent, and more behaviorally sophisticated than the simple competitive exclusion models that are typically used to assess habitat carrying capacity and population viability would suggest. Specifically, if the outcome of territorial contests between individual eagles and ospreys is influenced by accumulated behavioral experience that persists across multiple seasons and is potentially transmitted to offspring, then the expected distribution of the two species across recovering landscapes